I'm delighted to have this opportunity to introduce our speaker, Eli Clare. Like many of you, Mr. Clare was educated in liberal arts colleges. He has a Bachelor of Arts degree in Women's Studies from Mills College and holds an MFA in Creative Writing from Goddard College. Like many of you, he is passionate about social justice and puts his intellect and creativity to work as a poet, speaker, educator, activist, and, according to his webpage, rabble-rouser. He writes and speaks about a broad range of topics related to disability and queer and trans identities. His CV includes pages of workshops, lectures, readings, classroom presentations, panel discussions, trainings, and dialogues in colleges, conferences, communities, cafes, bookstores, and symposia across the US and Canada. He was explaining to us at dinner tonight how he's at the beginning of one set of speaking engagements, home for 10 days, and then gone for another 5 weeks. He is an accomplished poet, essayist, and scholar whose works appear in a variety of journals, magazines, and readers. He has published a book of poems and 2 books of essays, all of them available outside in the lobby after the talk, including the just-released Brilliant Imperfection, Grappling with Cure. There are copies of this book outside, and I would encourage you to buy a copy as a gift to yourself and take it with you, whatever you're doing over spring break, and read it. It is a wonderful book. Like Clare's other works, it speaks to theoretical questions and political concerns with embodied experience and eloquent expression. What I especially appreciated about this book was the way it carried out its subtitle, Grappling with Cure. The notion of cure has been a point of deep division in many parts of the disability community, including the autism communities that I've been studying for the last several years. The discourse so often becomes rancorous, and some of that needs to happen in order to assert dignity and voice and agency when those have been denied. But the divisiveness can also become exhausting and alienating, especially when it happens within the community or the movement. I found in Clare's book a wide-ranging exploration of many different yearnings for cure, meanings of cure, experiences of cure, implications of cure. And towards the end of the book, there is a list of no's, practices of cure that Mr. Clare simply cannot accept. But short of that line, there is a call to explore contradictory positions between people and within ourselves, and to hold contradiction in creative tension. This is an author who uses words like jostle, tangle, and messy, not to describe defects in our thinking or activism, but as necessary, even valuable states. At one point he says, "I let this multitude of relationships we have to disability, illness, suffering, injustice, and cure jostle me, knowing that I need this exact tangle of conflicting and overlapping conversations, holding it all, sickness and human vulnerability, health and disability, the need for and the rejection of cure is much harder work than writing anti-cure diatribes, and much more necessary." I hope you will hear, as I do, a relevance of these words, not just for autism activism or disability rights, but for a wide range of social justice issues. Mr. Clare has applied his brave humility, fierce perspective-taking, and compassionate advocacy across a wide range of issues. His talk tonight will address bad bodies and the way that declaring a body defective has been used not only to discredit disabled people, but also other marginalized groups seeking social justice. I cannot imagine a better keynote speaker for this symposium this year. Please join me in welcoming Eli Clare.
Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm so delighted to be here. Yeah, I'm delighted to be here. And thank you, everyone who made the symposium happen and who made my being here possible tonight. It's a lot of hard labor, and just thank you so much for that labor. Before I get started, I want to do a couple pieces of access checking in. For those of you who can hear, how's my volume? All the way in back, how's my volume? If that changes, wave your hand, stand up, holler, catch my attention in whatever way works, and we'll work on the volume. But don't throw rotten tomatoes. You know, they just make a lot of mess. There's a small PowerPoint presentation that goes with this talk, and for those of you who will be accessing the screen, how's the light? Do you need less light? Do you need more light? Is it about right where it is? Okay, again, if that changes, let us know and we can work on that. The next access thing is that there are a few copies of what I'm going to be reading tonight. Some copies in 12-point type and some copies in 18-point type. And so there aren't enough copies for all of you, but for folks who need a written copy for access, we have some. And if you could, let us know somehow right now if you would like a copy. We can pass those copies out. Also, the copies of the talk are on the web. If you've got a mobile device connected to the web, you can find a 12-point font copy at http://tinyurl.com/ZF5QWBC, and you can find an 18-point copy at tinyurl.com/ZAJPWFX. Feel free to download those PDFs. The only thing I ask is that they don't get distributed again, that you use them for your personal use, but you don't, for instance, repost them to the web or to your Facebook page. Other access stuff. You know, if you need to stand up and find a wall, stand up and find a wall. If you need to lie down on the floor, there's a lot of floor here. If you listen best by knitting or cross-stitching or playing with silly putty, do those things. If you need to rock or flap your hands or stim, do that. If you need to leave the room and not come back, do that. If you need to leave and then come back later, do that. In other words, let's mash this room up as much as possible to make it as accessible as possible for all of us. I also want to acknowledge that we're on Chinook and Multnomah land right now, and for those of us who are non-native and those of us who are white, we have responsibility far beyond acknowledgement to the indigenous people who live here today and who used to live here. And I also want to acknowledge that this whole symposium is happening in this really awful political moment where so much policy is being created right now around immigration and around access to healthcare and around how trans children and trans students are going to be treated at school, and so many unknowns right now. How bad is it going to be? And some of us are terrified by that. Some of us are terrified about the growing level of hate violence right now in the country. And at the same time, we're living in a time of the biggest, fiercest mobilization and resistance that I can remember. And folks I have worked with who spent time in the civil rights movement of the 1960s say, yeah, the last time the mobilization was this big was in the 1960s. So the symposium is happening within that context, and part of that context is this sorting of worthy body minds from unworthy body minds, deserving body minds and undeserving body minds, good body minds and body minds that we can afford to dispose of. And I'm going to be using the phrase body minds throughout my talk to resist the white Western binary that we've created that says the body's here and the mind is here, and they have very little to do with each other. My experience is instead is that bodies and minds are entangled in all sorts of ways. So I'm using the phrase body-mind. So I'm going to read for about 40 minutes. This talk is called Defective, Deficient, and Burdensome, Thinking About Bad Bodies. And it's punctuated by moments of poetry. And the poetry will also be projected on the screen. It's divided into 4 parts. 1, prayers, crystals, vitamins. Complete strangers offer me Christian prayers or crystals and vitamins, always with the same intent, to touch me, fix me, mend my cerebral palsy. If only I will comply. They cry over me, wrap their arms around my shoulders, kiss my cheek. Even now, after 5 decades of these kinds of interactions, I still don't know how to rebuff their pity, how to tell people the simple truth that I am not broken. Even if there were a cure for brain cells that died at birth, I'd refuse. I have no idea who I'd be without my tremoring and tense muscles, slurring tongue. They want to make me normal. They take for granted that my body-mind is wrong, bad, broken. The body-mind as gristle and synapse, water and bone, pure, empty space. Complete strangers ask me, what's your defect? To them, my body-mind simply doesn't work right. Defect being a variation of broken, supposedly neutral. But think of the things called defective. The MP3 player that won't turn on, the car that never ran reliably. They end up in the bottom drawer, dumpster, scrapyard. Defects are disposable, body minds or objects to eradicate. Complete strangers pat me on the head. They whisper platitudes in my ear, cliches about courage and inspiration. They enthuse about how remarkable I am. They declare me special. Not long ago, a white woman wearing dreamcatcher earrings and a fringed leather tunic with a medicine wheel on its back, grabbed me in a bear hug. She told me that I, like all people who tremor, was a natural shaman. And I'm not making this up. I'm not exaggerating this. You know, I couldn't make stories like this up even if I tried. She told me that I, like all people who tremor, was a natural shaman. Yes, a shaman. In that split second, racism and ableism tumbled into each other yet again. The entitlement that leads white people to co-opt indigenous spiritualities, tangling into the ableist stereotypes that bestow disabled people with spiritual qualities. She whispered in my ear that if I were trained, I could become a great healer, directing me never to forget my specialness. Oh, how special disabled people are. We have special education, special needs, special spiritual abilities. The word drips condescension. It's no better than being defective. It's simply another way to declare some body minds bad. And the heads up in this next paragraph or two, I'm going to be using some racist and ableist hate language, and I'm going to say some of those words out loud. Complete strangers, neighbors, and bullies have long called me retard. It doesn't happen so often now. Still, there's a guy down the road who, when he's drunk, taunts me as I walk by with my dog. But when I was a child, retard was a daily occurrence. Once on a camping trip with my family, I joined a whole crowd of kids playing tag in and around the picnic shelter. A slow, clumsy 9-year-old, I quickly became it. I chased and chased, but caught no one. The game turned. Kids came close, ducked away, yelling, retard. Frustrated, I yelled back for a while. Retard became monkey. My playmates circled me. Their words became a torrent. You're a monkey, monkey, monkey. I gulped, I choked, I sobbed. Frustration, shame, humiliation swallowed me. My body-mind crumpled. It lasted 2 minutes or 2 hours. I don't know. When my father appeared, the circle scattered. Through the word monkey, those kids joined a long legacy that names white disabled people and all people of color not quite human. The body-mind, a live wire, singing fear, hope, desire. They approached me with prayers and vitamins, taunts and endless questions, convinced that my body-mind is somehow bad, animal-like, defective, special, an inspiration, a tragedy. They leave me with sorrow, shame, and self-loathing. 2, defect. Across the centuries, how many communities have been declared inherently defective by white people, rich people, non-disabled people, men, backed by medical, scientific, academic, and state authority. I ask this question rather than answer it because any list I create will be incomplete. I think of white women suffragists fighting for the right to vote, declared defective as a way of undercutting their demands. Black people kidnapped from Africa and enslaved in the Americas, declared defective as a way to justify and strengthen the institution of slavery. Immigrants at Ellis Island declared defective and refused entry into the US. Lesbians and gay men declared defective in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and given hormones and shock therapy to cure their homosexuality. The list of people considered defective keeps growing, the damage deepening. Defectiveness holds such power because ableism builds and maintains the very notion that defective body minds are bad, undesirable, disposable. And the world without ableism can't quite imagine that world. But in a world without ableism, and ableism is a word used to describe the oppression that targets disabled people and chronically ill people, and folks who are perceived that way. In the world without ableism, defective as it is applied to humans, meaning the imperfection of a bodily system, would probably not even exist. But if it did, it would only be a neutral descriptor. However, in today's world, where ableism fundamentally shapes white Western cultural beliefs about normal and abnormal, worthy and unworthy, whole and broken body minds, any person or community named defective can be targeted without question or hesitation for eradication, imprisonment, institutionalization. The ableist invention of defectiveness unequivocally names many body minds bad. The body mind, a symbol, metaphor, academic abstraction, the body mind as history. And then this next section, there's going to be some description of historical and current racist violence. Defective arcs repeatedly through history. Let me trace a single trajectory starting in 1851, though I could begin nearly anywhere. Dr. Samuel Cartwright wrote in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal in 1851, quote, "It is this defective hematosis or atmospherization of the blood conjoined with the deficiency of cerebral matter in the cranium that has rendered the people of Africa unable to take care of themselves," end quote. Using scientific language, Cartwright defended and justified slavery, casting black people as inferior and racist stereotypes as medical truth. Defectiveness and deficiency lay at the center of his argument. In the same article, he coins several quote unquote diseases of the mind, including can't even say this, including dysesthesia ethiopica, which, according to Cartwright, led enslaved African Americans to be lazy. This diagnosis not only turned resistance into illness, but also allowed Cartwright to name white power and control as cure. He wrote, quote, "The complaint of dysesthesia ethiopica is easily curable. The best means is first to have the patient well washed with warm water and soap, then to anoint it all over in the oil, and to slap the oil in with a broad leather strap," end quote. Cartwright's sleight of hand is brutal. Enslaved Black people become patients, and the violence they endured becomes cure. The disabling nature of slavery is hidden away. Cartwright reveals in uncertain terms the social control embedded in the Declaration of Defectiveness. His words travel from 1851 to 1968, landing with white psychiatrists Walter Bromberg and Frank Simon, who pontificated, quote, "The stress of asserting civil rights in the United States these past 10 years and the corresponding nationalistic fervor of Afro-American nations has stimulated specific reactive psychoses in American Negroes," end quote. Cartwright's claims transform and yet stay the same. The 1851 defective hematosis twisting into the 1968 specific reactive psychoses. Bromberg and Simon continue, quote, "The particular symptomology we have observed, for which the term protest psychosis is suggested, is influenced by the civil rights movement and is colored by denial of Caucasian values and is, excuse me, let me back up, is influenced by the civil rights movement and is colored by a denial of Caucasian values. This protest psychosis among prisoners is virtually a repudiation of white civilization," end quote. In coining this new diagnosis, protest psychosis, cousin to schizophrenia, and declaring it widespread among Black people who defied white supremacy, they, like Cartwright, framed resistance as pathology. They used defectiveness yet again to justify violence, the locking up of Black people in prisons and psychiatric facilities and drugging them with antipsychotic meds. Bromberg and Simon's words travel from 1968 to 2014, landing in the grand jury testimony of white police officer Darren Wilson, who shot and killed young Black unarmed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. In his testimony, Wilson recounts the altercation that happened moments before the shooting. Quote, "When I grabbed him, I felt like a 5-year-old holding onto Hulk Hogan, who and a side note, is a 6'7", 300-pound professional wrestler. Wilson goes on, that's how big he felt and how small I felt, end quote. There's no reflection of an adult man and a teenager of almost equal size, both of them 6'4", Brown weighing more, and Wilson, the adult, armed and wielding the power of the state. Instead, Wilson creates a picture of a monstrously overpowering black man. He continues, claiming at one point that the 18-year-old, quote, had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon, end quote. Wilson remembers that once he started shooting, Brown was still, quote, coming at me. He hadn't slowed down. It looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, end quote. Brown becomes, in Wilson's story, a monster, an embodiment of evil, a superhuman, impervious to bullets. Unlike Cartwright, Bromberg, and Simon, Wilson doesn't characterize all black people as a group, wield diagnosis, or directly call Brown defective. Yet, in painting him as a monstrous, superhuman demon, Wilson calls upon centuries of white supremacist belief in black people as defectiveness. His testimony joins with dysesthesia, Ethiopica, and protest psychosis in naming African Americans defective. Cartwright and the rest invent bad bodies precisely to explain and justify the practices of slavery, imprisonment, institutionalization, and state violence. In essence, white supremacy fortifies itself by leveraging defectiveness. This dynamic isn't unique to racism. Sexism, homophobia, transphobia, colonialism and imperialism, anti-Semitism, and classism all leverage that ableist invention too. The body-mind as gut and bowel, hope and dread, literal trash. Entire body-minds, communities, cultures are squeezed into defective. And then that single blunt concept turns, becomes defect. Bullies hurl it as an insult. Strangers ask it out of curiosity. Doctors note it in medical files. Judges and juries hear it as testimony. Scientists study it as truth. Politicians write it into policy. Defect explodes with hate, power, and control. Defect creates bad bodies. 3, when we claim defectiveness. So as I was putting this keynote together, it became clear to me that we can talk for a long time about how defectiveness is imposed upon us and all of the forces that do that imposition. But it became clear to me that I also wanted to think about what happens when some of us claim defectiveness for ourselves. That I felt like that was an important thing to acknowledge as a dynamic. And so in this section, when we claimed effectiveness, I turned specifically to trans people and trans community to think about the dynamic of some people's claimed effectiveness for ourselves. And this is uncomfortable to acknowledge in public. You know, it feels a little like talking about dirty laundry in public. And so for trans folks in the room, I want to say I'm not calling us out to shame us. I'm talking about this to explore the whole range of what effectiveness means in terms of power and privilege and marginalization and selfhood and identity and self-determination. All too often, effectiveness is hurled at us, but there are times when marginalized people claim it as their own. I'm thinking about the trans people who frame their transness as a defect and gender transition as a cure. I come to this conversation as a disabled genderqueer living as a white man in the world. For me, my slow turn from girl to tomboy to butch woman to genderqueer wasn't about fixing a defect, but rather about desire and comfort, transition, a door, a window, a cobalt sky. However, for some trans people, transition is an unequivocal cure. But let me back up for a moment and talk about cure and its inextricable connection to defectiveness. As an ideology seeped into every corner of Western thought and culture, cure rides on the back of normal and natural. Insidious and pervasive, it impacts most of us. The American Heritage Dictionary defines cure as, quote, the restoration of health, end quote. Springboarding from this definition, it would be all too easy to get mired in an argument about health, trying to determine who's healthy and who's not, as if there's one objective standard. Instead, I want to follow the word restoration. To restore a damaged prairie ecosystem is to return it to an earlier and often better state of being. In this return, we try to undo the harm, wishing the harm had never happened. Needless to say, ecosystem restoration is a complex undertaking, a fluid, responsive process. It requires digging into the past, stretching toward the future, working hard in the present. Restoring a tallgrass prairie means rebuilding an ecosystem that has been destroyed by the near extinction of bison, the presence of cattle, and generations of monoculture, farming, and fire suppression. The goal isn't to recreate a static landscape somehow frozen in time, but rather to foster dynamic interdependencies ranging from clods of dirt to towering thunderheads, tiny microbes to herds of bison, into a self-sustaining system of constant flux. Excuse me. An amplified cough. This work builds upon knowledge about and experience with an 8,000-year-old ecosystem of which only remnants remain. Isolated pockets of lead plants, milkweed, bur oaks, and switchgrass growing in cemeteries and on remote bluffs. The intention is to mirror this historical ecosystem as closely as possible, even though some element is bound to be missing or different. The return close but not complete. Through it all, this process requires both belief and desire. A belief that what existed before is superior to what exists currently, and the desire to return to that past. I circle back to the ideology of care. Framing it as a kind of restoration reveals the most obvious and essential tenets. First, care requires the existence of damage, deficiency, or defectiveness, locating this harm entirely within individual human body minds, operating as if each person were their own ecosystem. Second, it grounds itself in an original state of being, relying upon a belief that what existed before is superior to what exists currently. And finally, it seeks to return what is damaged to that former state of being. Within the ideology of care, the state of being is unambiguously non-disabled, heterosexual, white, cisgender, and gender conforming. But for some of us, even if we accept disability as damage to individual body minds, these ideas about restoration quickly become tangled, maybe even nonsensical, because an original non-disabled body mind doesn't exist. How would I or the medical industrial complex go about restoring my body mind? The vision of me without trembling hands and slurred speech, with more balance and coordination, doesn't originate from my visceral history. Rather, it arises from some imagination of what my body mind should be like, from definitions of normal and abnormal, whole and defective, good and bad. The body-mind as ink on paper, court order, medical diagnosis, data on file. Now let me return to the idea of transness as defect and gender transition as cure. Some folks name their transness a birth defect, a disability in need of repair. The word defect always takes my breath away. It's a punch in the stomach. These folks reason I should have easy access to competent, respectful health care, just as other disabled people do. I simply need a cure. Their logic makes me incredulous, even as I work to respect the people who name their transness this way. Do they really believe disability ensures decent, much less good, health care? I could tell 1,000 stories, cite pages of statistics confirming the opposite, and rant for hours about ableism in the medical industrial complex. I hate their unquestioned acceptance of care. To couple disability with the need for cure, accepts wholesale some of the ableism that disabled people struggle with every day. It takes for granted that disability is an individual medical problem, curable or at least treatable by doctors. It runs counter to the work of disability activists who frame disability as an issue of social justice, not of medical condition. Disability lies not in paralysis, but rather in stairs without an accompanying ramp, not in dyslexia, but in teaching methods unwilling to flex. It ignores the reality that many disabled people are more interested in liberation than in cure. But I need to pause for a moment. Until the early 1990s, when trans communities began finding strong collective voices, medical providers' explicit goal for gender transition was to create normal heterosexual men and women who never again identified as trans, gender non-conforming, gay, lesbian, or bi. In other words, the framing of transness as defect and abnormality to be corrected didn't start with trans people, but with the medical industrial complex. And then there are the very real forces of gender dissonance and body-mind dysphoria. Scholar Alexander Burrell reflects, quote, "The problem of framing transness as a defect resides, I believe, not in the concept of transness as disability, but in such individualist, ableist, pathologizing views of disability." He continues, describing his experience as a white, transsexual, disabled man, quote, "My transness has been and continues to be a debilitating and disabling component of my life. My dysphoria, although much less intense than before my transition, is a constant presence that manifests itself through a variety of concerns that taken separately might seem insignificant, but that taken together reveal persistent discomfort about my body. This dysphoria is as psychologically disabling as my other mental disabilities," end quote. Rather than resorting to some naive and stereotyped notion of defect, Burrell is grappling with a complex tangle. His words ask me to sit with the reality of gender dysphoria as a sometimes overwhelming and or disabling force. Still other trans people turn the idea of gender dissonance inside out, refusing to name transness a disease and gender nonconformity a pathology. Their refusal locates dysphoria not in individual trans people, but rather in a world that often denies, mocks, and criminalizes our genders. Gender transition as an open door, transness as a defect to fix, gender dysphoria as disability, transgender identities as non-pathologized body-mind differences. All these relationships to defectiveness and cure exist at the same time. The body-mind, a grunt, a wail, a gust of pleasure. So number 4, so the last section of this talk: normal and natural. The white Western world pushes normal weight, normal walking, normal ways of thinking, feeling, communicating, loving, and being, as if normal were a goal to achieve and maintain. Sometimes normal connects itself to natural. Multinational corporations marketing natural beauty, natural strength, natural skin every day, as if natural were a product to sell. At the same time, white Western beliefs separate human animals from non-human nature and devalue the natural world. Coupled with capitalism, these beliefs drive an out-of-control greed for and consumption of coal and trees, fish and crude oil, water and land, drive the destruction of what is natural, drive the declaration of cornfields as more productive and necessary than prairie. In short, the white Western world both desires to be natural and destroys what is natural, depending on the context. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. The standards called normal, sometimes in tandem with natural, are promoted as averages. They are posed as the most common and best states of being for body minds. They are advertised as a description of who we, in big air quotes, descriptions of who we collectively are. A we who is predictably white, male, middle, and upper class, non-disabled, Christian, heterosexual, gender-conforming, slender, cisgender. And at the very same time, these standards, which supposedly reflect some sort of collective humanity, are sold back to us as goals and products. It makes no sense. Really, it makes no sense. At the same time, the consequences and dangers of being deemed abnormal and defective mount up. Queer and trans youth kicked out of their families and homes, immigrants of color detained and deported, Black men 4 times more likely than white men to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people, many of them disabled, imprisoned in record numbers and targeted for state violence, poor people called lazy, shiftless, and demonized for their own poverty. Those of us whose body minds are considered bad, deficient, burdensome, disposable, pay such a high price. And it is this price that sustains the nonsensical power of normal and natural. But the body minds of marginalized peoples are more than the ways we've been sorted as bad and good, more than the histories of violence, more than the objects of pity and bullying, more than signs of pathology and defectiveness, more than burden and deficiency, more than targets of police brutality. I insist upon the body-mind as protest, resistance, everyday truth. Thank you. Thank you. It's 8:05, and we can do one of two things now, or we can do both of them, and I kind of need help figuring out what we do next. So one of the things is we could stay in a big group and have some community conversation, which is often called question and answer, but that assumes that you all have questions and I have answers, and I know that's not how it works. So that's one of the things we could do. The other thing we could do is to get into small groups of 3 or 4 people and talk about the following. What are some additional ways in which body minds are created as bad and defective? What are some additional dangers and consequences of being deemed defective? And third, have you been impacted by defective? So we could do some small group discussion, or we could do both. We could first do a little bit of small group discussion and then come back together for a big group. What are people up for? And I'm partly asking because I know it's in the end of a really long day for people, and I want to give people who need to leave right now, I want to give them a moment to leave without feeling like you're interrupting. And then I want to see what you all are up for. That small group conversation may feel like too much for you right now, or it may feel like exactly what you need right now. So help me out here. Small groups, I'm hearing a lot. So let's do about 10 minutes of small group work and then come back together for some big group conversation. So I want to make... Okay. I'm like... So before we divide up into small groups, I want to make sure that these prompting questions make sense to people. Yes? So groups of 3 or 4, spend about 10 minutes talking, practice listening rather than advice giving. This is not a time to give people advice. You know, we so confuse listening and advice giving. Unless someone specifically asks for advice, just listen. And if you get stuck, holler and they'll come join your group. I can't promise that I'll help you get unstuck, but I can be part of the conversation. So about 10 minutes and then we'll come back together. So as I said before, this part of an event is often thought of as question and answer. But for me, this is an opportunity for community dialogue. When a room erupts in conversation like this room, I know I'm missing the very best parts of the event. So part of this community conversation is me getting to hear little bits and pieces of what you talked about. But really, this is a time for what's in your heads and what's in your hearts. What are your rants and raves? What are your soapboxes? What are your disagreements? What are your confusions? And there are people going to be coming around with microphones, and I know that some of you are loath to talk into a microphone, and yet I'm going to ask people to wait to speak until a microphone comes to you, because speaking into a microphone lets this conversation be accessible to more people in the room. So I'm really going to ask that you wait until the mic comes to speak.
I was wondering, as someone who has defects, how do you acknowledge your what would be classified as a defect in a way that's empowering instead of disempowering?
I would love to have that conversation for the next 3 hours, right? If there was a bullet, if there was a chalkboard here, I would love to brainstorm the 400 words we could use rather than the word defect. What are the words that empower us to name parts of who we are, parts of what our body minds do or be in the world? What are the words we use to describe what's happening to us that don't fill us with shame, that don't fill us with loathing, that don't tap into our own hatred or other people's hatred of those things? Am I catching some of what you're asking?
Yeah.
So I want to, rather than me say, I want to use this community to what are the ways we name those pieces of ourselves in ways that are empowering.
Squeeze in here. Yeah, thank you. Personally, I think a great example of that, I am autistic and recently have kind of come into contact with the model of, you were talking earlier about how a defect has to necessarily be framed in what is seen as normal. And so I think a great thing is to uncouple the difference from being normal from the difference from being good. So I heard the term neurodiversity, neuroatypical, and I really was able to just grab onto that because I think that being autistic is good. I've gotten to that mental place. It's I'm able to do some things better than people who aren't autistic, and I'm not able to do some things. I do still get really overstimulated in crowded rooms sometimes, just turn into a pumpkin if there's too much noise. But I mean, I feel like it is a good thing, even if it does have its drawbacks. And I think the concept of neurodiversity really lets me grab onto that, different, but not bad, just kind of specialized for something. You can go ahead and snag that down.
Thank you. Who else has a name or a way of describing that works for you?
So I'm sort of on, wow, that's really weird and echoey. I'm sort of on the opposite end of you and on the same end because I'm also on the spectrum, and I really do like neuroatypical is kind of how I describe myself the most. But I also tend to, use phrases like bad brains and things like that that does sort of play with what people mean, in sort of maybe an angry or defiant way, I guess, of just kind of I can call myself that and you can't, and what are you gonna do about it?
So little of the reclaimed language. Yeah. Other thoughts, other things, other words, other ideas, other descriptions that work for folks?
I really liked the last slide that said the body mind as protest, resistance, everyday truth. And I think I would add the body mind as poetry, disability as poetry, black as poetry, brown as poetry, genderqueer as poetry. And I think what gives me pain is when the world doesn't recognize it as poetry.
Thank you. For me, part of the work is working on shame. Like, while I'm still ashamed of some part of my body mind, it's much easier to fall into the language of defect and bad and wrong. And so for me, some of the work is about adopting language, but other parts of the work are about digging through the shame that underlies why defect is such a hook. Does that make sense?
I think that like processing shame is a really important thing to do and something that's helped me in my life.
So what else is in people's hearts and heads right now?
I think the idea of a liberal arts education is on a lot of our minds and on how, you know, the humanities are valued. And I, like I mentioned to you earlier, also grew up in New England and have lived in New England, and that's, I feel like, in a lot of ways, like the mecca of liberal arts education. I was wondering if you could speak to your experience at all about how this like very prestigious sort of like privileged old boys club of liberal arts education, as it can often be, has impacted or has kind of meshed or not meshed with your experience.
Wow. 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 I'm so struck by how that question is embedded in this moment where education is under attack. Education all over the country in many different institutions is under attack. How public schools are under attack. How disabled children's presence in public schools are under attack. What austerity means for K through 12 education, for preschool education, for Head Start, for state universities, and for private liberal arts colleges. How, like, I can't answer that specific question about liberal arts education without acknowledging the tremendous attack right now on education, and particularly what attack on public education means for marginalized people who historically don't have access to education at all, historically and present day. And having said that, I am someone who believes in education for education's sake. I know that makes me a dinosaur. And I'll proudly claim being a dinosaur, but I think education for education's sake is worth a whole lot. I think to be in the world, we need critical thinking skills. We need to know how to dissect a news story. We need to know how to come to grips with what that advertisement is trying to tell us about our body minds or our community. We need the critical thinking skills to know what we think of a politician who's trying to convince us that imprisonment is a good thing, or deportation is a good thing, or universal health care is a good thing. It's not just that we need critical thinking skills to think about the right. We need critical thinking skills to think about the left, too. We need critical thinking skills because without those critical thinking skills, we can be so easily seduced. So easily seduced. You know, I think of fake news. How do we know when news isn't fake? Really, that's a real question. How do we know when news isn't fake? We know it because we learn those critical thinking skills. We don't get born intuitively knowing that stuff. Education for education's sake is important. I also know that education for getting jobs is important. I know that vocational training is important. I'm not denying that. But education is more than getting employment. So liberal arts education. Part of critical thinking is having a broad base of education, knowing some science and some poetry, knowing some computer skills and knowing some history, knowing some political science, some sociology, some anthropology, some chemistry, some biology, some physics, some business sense, some economic theory. Like, when I say education for education's sake, I mean that broad, know little about a lot of stuff before we decide what we're going to specialize in. And guess what? Some of us are never going to specialize. Some of us are never going to choose one thing or one discipline or one focus. Some of us are going to stay interested in a myriad of things and topics and ideas and possibilities and images and language. And we need all of it. We need all of it. And we need education that's valued outside the academy. If I have a critique of liberal arts education, it's kind of an attitude that the only place to get good education is inside liberal arts institutions. And we need to value education everywhere it happens. And we need to create infrastructure for community schools and infrastructure for web-based education and infrastructure for really kick-ass public education in places where public education has become a warehouse and has become a pipeline into prisons. We need to value education everywhere it happens. So I think I'll step off my soapbox and acknowledge that I barely touched your question. Over here.
Hi. So I am remembering my childhood and remembering how wanting, needing, or even liking connection was always seen as defective and always seen as something to demonize. And that seems to me as something that along that big list just doesn't make any sense. And I'm wondering how we can do a better job in a society that doesn't really value connection. I think Lewis and Clark does a good job of fostering connection, but in general, of offering connection to those people who really are in need.
So another way to ask that question is, how do we make community, right? How do we make and value community? And again, I don't want to answer that. I want to open that up. How do you make community? How do you prioritize community? How do you say connection matters? What do you do? And that's a real question. What do you do in your daily lives to prioritize community?
I think for me, I've definitely been in a situation like that, or a point in my life like that, where I've lacked community, and it's been, it was really, really tough. Humans need that connection to feel like they're thriving and like they're happy and healthy. And I think for me, one of the things that has always helped in creating community is asking for it. Asking people who I know love me, who might be busy with their own lives, busy in other communities that they are involved in, just reaching out and asking for a connection, saying, hey, I'm in need of one, could you provide that for me? And luckily, I've been fortunate to have a lot of people who are able to do that. But even if it's just one person just asking for that connection has always been really helpful to me.
Up here.
I think, what was your name? You asked Abe? I think what you said about the last, about people wanting to, like, how do we give empathy to the people who are in need of empathy? I just think in general we should have more empathy for everyone, and then eventually, like with that, we will be able to give people who need, connection more easily and more readily available. And that's just the way I feel. I feel like there's a big issue with people attaching themselves more to, more to what's happening as a system and not individually. And I just think if we are able to attach ourselves more to the people who are operating within certain institutions, then we will be able to become more empathetic and give connection better, if that made sense.
A small thing, but I am always really appreciative and know that I talk often with friends about just like saying hello to people that even have just met once or maybe even haven't met at all. Just that like recognition of like, you're a human, I'm a human is really nice, and I think goes a long way in ways that we might not expect. But I know for me, if there's someone that I've only met once or know through someone or maybe don't even know at all, like them saying hello, I remember for like the rest of the day. I'm like, oh, what a nice little, and so I feel like even, I guess kind of going off of your point about like individual connection, just that really like micro connection with someone is really valuable.
I think too, in creating communities of whatever size, but I guess even specifically two people, maybe is sort of like the promise of reciprocation, you know, like maybe connecting with somebody, but starting with like, I'm gonna listen to you and care about what you have to say, and then hopefully you'll listen to me and care about what I have to say. And I don't know, to me that's the most important kind of community, especially when people are, you know, struggling with hearing bad things about themselves and things like that.
Up here.
I just wanted to say too that public space is really important for me, and I'm privileged to live in a city that has like a decent public transportation system where I actually, you know, go to work every day sitting next to people who are potentially my neighbors or travelers or whoever they may be, and making an effort to actually look people in the eye and sort of have a certain basic humane acknowledgement of people's humanity in public space. I've also been a person who struggled from feeling isolated and being isolated from my communities in many different times in my life, and trying to de-isolate my actual sort of physical existence by volunteering with groups that I care about or what have you, or being in a park, which is a public space, and being open to engagement with strangers is one of the ways in which I've sort of combated that. And that doesn't, you know, and so if I hear about the awesome, you know, queer benefit show that's happening, even if I don't know if anybody I know will be there, will still at times force myself to go. And that doesn't mean that I don't always feel, you know, sometimes I go and I still feel totally isolated and alone in that space. But there's also the potential for community building and for sort of mutual recognition. And I think, you know, advocating for a society in which we have more public spaces like that is important, because our society has been developed in a way that's so individualized. People drive in their individual cars. They live in their individual studio apartments. They listen to their individual iPods as they walk down the street. So I try to live with roommates, not only because I can't afford any other way of living, but it also helps keep me engaged in a social realm that I wouldn't necessarily have otherwise.
So we probably have time for one or two more comments, and then probably ought to break. And I'll stick around for some one-on-one time and some book signing time. But I'm wondering if there are one or two more comments, not necessarily on this community thread, but just last things people want to say. Mike's coming down here. Thank you, the folks who are running mics. Not an easy job in a room like this.
So I really appreciated what all of you just had to say about community, and I wanted to tie in what my small group sort of talked about, which was we focused on emotions and feelings as a way of being deemed defective, because a lot of times in our institutions and society, our emotions are invalidated and we're asked not to be too emotional. And as a result, we talked about how this gets stored inside, and it's painful and it causes trauma and oppression. And I think when we talk about creating community, it's important to note that what all of you talked about, making eye contact, smiling, reaching out and talking to people, it involves emotions that are difficult to deal with. And even when I bring up emotions, like I can feel my hands getting sweaty and my heart rate increasing, because it's not talked about enough in our culture. So yeah, we talked about this concept of emotional justice, and that is something that we need to seek out in order to not have even the things that make us human, our emotions and our feelings, be deemed defective. And that's really hard to do, but it's comforting and relieving to have a community to do that in, and to bring up emotions in and feel safe to do so. So I thank all of you at Lewis and Clark for creating that space. and continuing to create it.
So does someone have one last burning question, comment, thought? Going once, going twice, going 3 times.
Okay, this may be like super millennial of me to say, but I promise like it doesn't come from that place at all. But something that's always been really powerful for me as like a queer kid from like rural Illinois is the power of like online communities. And it's something that I've never taken for granted, because seeing people that are fat and that look like me online is so powerful. And seeing people that are queer online has always been something that has been really gratifying for me, when you're in a space that publicly no one looks like you, or no one, or no one is like quote unquote out. And so I think, yeah, online, even though we all know what that is and we do it all the time, I think it's really important for community. Right. That's all.
So I want to connect the dots between how isolation feeds a sense of defectiveness, and how community is one of the ways to resist that feeding of defectiveness. So I really want to thank you all for being here tonight, and for all that you have brought to this room, and all that you bring to all the communities that you're part of. Thank you.